Picture standing at the edge of an ancient land where the golden sands of the Nile Valley stretch endlessly under a scorching sun, a place where history whispers secrets so strange they defy modern logic. This is Nubia, a civilization often overshadowed by its famous neighbor Egypt, yet brimming with mysteries that rival even the most fantastical legends. Hidden beneath the surface of this forgotten kingdom lie cultural practices so bizarre, so utterly unlike anything we know today, they'll make you question everything you thought you understood about the ancient world. Imagine a society where crocodiles weren't feared, they were worshipped as sacred guardians, where warriors wore the skins of their fallen enemies not just as trophies but as spiritual armor, where elaborate rituals turned the dead into living symbols of power, their bodies preserved and paraded through the streets centuries after their deaths. These weren't just isolated customs, they were threads in the vibrant, unbreakable fabric of Nubian culture, a civilization that thrived for thousands of years along the banks of the Nile, shaping trade, religion, and warfare across Africa and beyond. For centuries, Nubia stood as a beacon of wealth and ingenuity, its towering pyramids rivaling Egypt's, its ironworkers forging tools so advanced they became legendary. Yet beneath this veneer of sophistication lay a world of rituals and traditions that would shock even the most adventurous historian. Today, we're peeling back the layers of time to reveal 30 of the most astonishing practices ever recorded, customs that range from the awe-inspiring to the downright unsettling. You'll witness how Nubian queens wielded absolute authority through sacred intoxication, how children were initiated into adulthood through trials no modern mind could fathom, and why some of the most revered healers in history relied on methods that blur the line between medicine and magic. This isn't just a journey into the past, it's a confrontation with the extraordinary, a chance to see humanity through a lens so foreign, it'll leave you questioning what's truly normal. So brace yourself, because the world of ancient Nubia is about to rewrite everything you thought you knew. Among the most striking and visually arresting customs of ancient Nubia was the practice of ritual scarification, a tradition far more profound than mere decoration. These weren't just random patterns etched into skin, they were sacred armor believed to shield the wearer from malevolent forces lurking in the unseen world. Nubians, particularly in the kingdom of Kush, transformed their bodies into living canvases of spiritual power, with each scar telling a story of protection, identity, and divine connection. The process was as precise as it was painful. Healers and priests used razor-sharp obsidian blades or thorns from the acacia tree to carve intricate designs, zigzags mimicking the Nile's flow, dots representing ancestral stars, or symbols linked to gods like Apidamak, the lion-headed warrior deity. These ceremonies weren't done in secrecy, but during communal gatherings where elders chanted incantations to infuse the wounds with protective energy. Archaeological finds from sites like Kerma reveal ceramic pots stained with medicinal resins, likely applied to prevent infection while symbolically sealing the spiritual pact. What's truly remarkable is how these scars transcended the individual. In Nubian belief, a marked body disrupted evil spirits' vision, rendering the wearer invisible to their malice. Warriors bore them for invincibility in battle, mothers for safeguarding childbirth, and children as rites of passage into adulthood. Even today, faint traces of these patterns survive on mummified remains, their raised lines still whispering of a time when skin wasn't just flesh, it was a fortress. Far from arbitrary, each cut was a calculated defiance against chaos, a permanent reminder that in Nubia, the spiritual and physical worlds were forever intertwined. Now picture this: a sacred cemetery where the graves don't hold human remains, but the mummified bodies of enormous crocodiles, each meticulously wrapped in linen and adorned with gold. In Nubia, these fearsome reptiles weren't just predators lurking in the Nile's murky depths. they were revered as living incarnations of Sobek, the god of fertility and military prowess. The Nubians took their devotion to staggering extremes, burying crocodiles with the same reverence reserved for kings, complete with elaborate funeral rites and tombs filled with offerings meant to accompany them into the afterlife. At sites like Jebel Sheikh Suleiman, archaeologists have uncovered crocodile mummies nestled in ceremonial poses, their jaws bound shut with strips of cloth to symbolically contain their ferocity. Some were buried with tiny bronze fish and jars of honey offerings to sustain them in the realm of the gods. But the most astonishing finds, juvenile crocodiles carefully arranged around larger adults, suggesting the Nubians practiced a form of sacred breeding, raising these creatures within temple precincts solely for ritual purposes. The rituals themselves were anything but simple. Priests would anoint the crocodile's scales with fragrant oils, chanting spells to awaken their divine essence. Then, in a breathtaking display of devotion, worshippers would process through the streets carrying the mummified creatures on litters, their tails dragging in the dust as crowds threw flowers and amulets in their path. These processions weren't just about honoring a deity, they were a public reaffirmation of Nubia's pact with the natural world, a belief that humanity's survival depended on appeasing the forces embodied by these ancient reptiles. What makes these burials even more extraordinary is their scale. Unlike in Egypt, where crocodile mummies are occasional curiosities, Nubian sites reveal mass graves with dozens of specimens, some stacked like logs in communal tombs. The message was clear: the Nile's power demanded constant vigilance, and only by honoring its most dangerous inhabitants could the Nubians ensure their kingdom's prosperity. Today, the silent rows of linen-wrapped bodies serve as a haunting reminder of a civilization that saw divinity not just in the stars or statues, but in the glittering eyes of a creature most would flee from on sight. The Nubian warrior's path to glory wasn't just tested by battle, it was sealed with a chalice of blood. Greek historians like Herodotus documented rituals so visceral they blurred the line between myth and reality. Aspiring fighters, often barely past adolescence, were brought before tribal elders and handed a cup filled with the still warm blood of a freshly slaughtered bull or lion. This wasn't mere symbolism, it was a lethal sacrament believed to transfer the beast's raw power directly into the drinker's veins. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Those who hesitated or gagged were cast out in disgrace, while those who drained the cup gained not just status, but something far more profound, an unbreakable bond with the spirit of the animal itself. Herodotus writes of a ceremony near Mara where initiates were given a choice: drink from the skull of a fallen enemy or from a sacred antelope. The latter promised speed and grace, but the former absolute dominion in combat. Anthropologists speculate these rituals stemmed from a profound animist belief that life force resided not just in the body but in the very blood that flowed through it. Wall carvings at Naka depict warriors mid-ritual, their faces tilted skyward as elders pour crimson streams into their mouths, their muscles already taut with anticipated transformation. But the most harrowing accounts come from Nubian oral traditions. One legend tells of a boy who drank the blood of a black-maned lion, only to wake the next morning with his hair coarsened into a mane and his nails grown to claws. Another describes a warrior who, after consuming the blood of a rival tribesman, began speaking in the dead man's voice during battles. Whether these were embellishments or earnest beliefs matters less than what they reveal. A culture where strength wasn't just earned, it was ingested, where the boundary between man and beast dissolved in a single, gruesome act of devotion. Modern excavations have uncovered ceremonial daggers with residues of hemoglobin and iron, silent witnesses to rites that would make even the most hardened historian shudder. What's often overlooked is the precision behind the horror. These weren't frenzied acts but calculated ceremonies timed to lunar cycles or the flooding of the Nile. The blood was often mixed with fermented sorghum or hallucinogenic herbs, perhaps to ease ingestion or to induce visions confirming the spirit's transfer. And the warriors themselves, they didn't just vanish into the desert afterward. They spent months in isolation, their bodies monitored for signs of possession, their dreams analyzed by seers for omens. Only when the elders were satisfied that the blood had truly taken root in the fighter's soul was he allowed to join the ranks, not just as a soldier but as something more. Something other. The archaeological record shows these initiates were later buried with animal bones clenched in their hands, their teeth stained dark from years of ritual repetition, their graves positioned to face the hunting grounds of the very creatures they'd consumed. In Nubia, courage wasn't born, it was swallowed. In the royal courts of Nubia, a single strand of hair could mean the difference between life and death. Kings and queens of Kush wore their crowns with one sacred lock left uncut, a thick, coiled tress smeared with a paste of crushed lapis lazuli and frankincense, believed to contain the very essence of their soul. This wasn't mere superstition, it was statecraft woven into flesh. To touch it without permission, that was treason punishable by impalement, a fate so gruesome even whispering about it was forbidden. The rituals surrounding this lock were as precise as they were perilous. Every new moon, royal barbers bound by blood oaths would carefully wash the lock in water mixed with gold dust, then anoint it with oils while chanting spells from the Book of the Dead. Wall reliefs at Jebel Barkal show queens kneeling as priests stretched their sacred locks toward the sun god Ammon, the hair acting as a living antenna between heaven and earth. But the most chilling detail, if a ruler fell gravely ill, the lock would be severed and burned in a private ceremony, transferring their remaining life force to a chosen successor. Archaeologists working in Mara discovered a macabre twist to this tradition. A vault beneath a pyramid containing nothing but clay jars filled with severed locks, each labeled with a pharaoh's name in delicate hieratic script. Some jars showed residue of venomous serpent venom, suggesting certain locks were weaponized post-mortem, perhaps as cursed relics against enemies. Even in death, that hair held power. But the true horror lay in the consequences for trespassers. A 1st century Greek merchant's account tells of a servant who accidentally brushed Queen Amenishakito's lock while arranging her headdress. Within hours, his body reportedly convulsed as if gripped by invisible hands, his skin blackening where he'd made contact. By dawn, he'd been entombed alive beneath the palace threshold, a warning woven into the very architecture. Modern excavations at Napa under the cold glow of a full moon, Nubian priests performed rites that would chill even the bravest souls, ceremonies where the dead were not just remembered but summoned. These weren't quiet prayers whispered at gravesides, they were full-bodied encounters with the departed, orchestrated with precision in hidden desert sanctuaries. At sites like Wad Ban Nokka, archaeologists have uncovered circular stone platforms etched with grooves to catch blood offerings, surrounded by piles of baboon skulls and shattered pottery stained with residues of datura and blue lotus hallucinogens that flung open the gates between worlds. The rituals followed a terrifying script. As the moon reached its zenith, bare-chested priests draped in leopard skins would arrange 7 ancestral skulls in a crescent, each anointed with a different oil: frankincense for wisdom, myrrh for truth, and the rancid fat of Nile crocodiles for strength. Then came the brewing of the kolat, a thick, purplish drink made from fermented tamarind and powdered human bone, often from a revered elder's remains. Wall paintings in the Temple of Ammon at Mara show priests raising skull cups toward the moon, their pupils blown wide from the brew, while shadowy figures emerge from the earth behind them. What happened next straddles the line between archaeology and nightmare. Accounts from Nubian funerary texts describe the skulls singing in high-pitched voices, their jawbones clacking without human touch. The priests would then enter a trance, writhing on the ground as they channeled messages, warnings of droughts, strategies for war, even the locations of hidden gold mines. One particularly vivid stele recounts a priestess who vomited live scarab beetles while speaking in the voice of a queen dead for 3 centuries, her words leading to the discovery of a secret water source that saved a city. The aftermath was as ritualized as the summoning. Before dawn, the skulls were fed with drops of sheep's blood and honey, then wrapped in linen soaked in acacia sap to seal the spirits back into the underworld. Any priest who failed to complete this step was said to be haunted by the ancestors' unrest, a fate illustrated in a grisly mural at Kawa, showing a man with his eyes and tongue removed, his body overgrown with phantom hands. Modern excavations have turned up priestly burials with amulets of twisted silver wire inside their mouths, perhaps meant to trap wayward spirits. Far from superstition, these ceremonies were a cornerstone of Nubian governance. A cache of clay tablets from Sedenga records prophecies that accurately predicted the rise and fall of dynasties, right down to the names of future kings. The most unsettling find, a child's skull drilled with tiny holes, its interior coated in gold, likely a true seeing artifact used to peer into the future. In Nubia, the dead weren't gone. They were advisors waiting in the dark, their wisdom harvested under moonlight like a crop more valuable than grain. In the shadowed corners of Nubian homes, beneath woven reed ceilings and walls painted with protective symbols, families lived side by side with their ancestors, not as distant memories, but as physical presences. Unlike cultures that buried their dead far from daily life, the Nubians of Upper Kush practiced something extraordinary. Chinese letter, mummified relatives enshrined in household niches, treating them as active participants in family affairs for generations. These weren't hidden relics, but revered members of the household, their desiccated hands still clasping ceremonial staffs, their eye sockets filled with polished obsidian to see the living. The process began immediately after death. Using techniques even older than Egypt's, Nubian embalmers would remove the organs through incisions coated in beeswax, then pack the cavities with a blend of natron salt and aromatic resins from punt. But here's where they diverged. Instead of entombing the body, they positioned it in a seated posture on a woven mat within a special alcove by the hearth, the spine deliberately straightened to mimic alertness. Wall paintings at Karanog show these domestic shrines draped in indigo cloth, with small offering tables at the ancestors' feet piled with sorghum bread, dates, and most hauntingly tiny clay cups still bearing traces of beer. Mourning rituals were precise. The eldest living daughter would approach the niche at dawn, anointing the mummy's lips with milk while murmuring updates about harvests or marriages. During disputes, family members would gather before the ancestor as if seeking judgment, sometimes waiting hours for signs, a creak of the house, a shift in the mummy's posture, or the sudden appearance of a scarab beetle crawling from the corpse's wrappings. One pottery shard from Faras records a legal argument where a widow consulted her husband's mummy for 3 days before it approved a land sale by shedding a fragment of its ear cartilage. Archaeology confirms how deeply this belief permeated daily life. Excavations at Casa Ibrahim revealed multi-generational homes with skeletal remains still seated in wall recesses, their skulls carefully drilled with holes to allow breathing. Some mummies wore layers of jewelry added over centuries, a child's bead necklace coiled around a wrist, then a grandson's copper ring slipped onto the same finger decades later. The most poignant find, a mummy from the Meroitic period with its jaw rigged by flax cords to create a nodding motion, suggesting some families may have physically manipulated ancestors to simulate responses. But this intimacy with death wasn't without rules. During the annual flooding of the Nile, when the veil between worlds was believed thinnest, families would seal the niches with mud plaster to prevent overstimulation of the dead. Those who ignored this taboo risked nightmares or worse. A 1st-century Ostracan tells of a merchant who mocked the tradition, only to wake finding his ancestor's mummy beside his sleeping mat, its linen unraveled to reveal flesh that had inexplicably regrown. By sunrise, the man was blind. What modern minds might dismiss as superstition served a profound social function. These ever-present ancestors were the glue of Nubian kinship, their physical continuity bridging past and future in a land where oral tradition was sacred. A child learning to count might do so by touching the finger bones of a great-grandparent. A bride's dowry negotiations often took place before her lineage's mummies as silent witnesses. Even in death, the ancestors taught their teeth worn from decades of grinding wild grains, silently instructing the living on perseverance, their posture an eternal reminder of dignity. The practice only ended when Christianity reached Nubia in the 6th century, but traces lingered. Well into the medieval period, families kept skulls on door lintels for protection, and some Nubian villages still leave portions of meals on high shelves for those who came before. In a civilization without written histories, the dead were living libraries, their preserved faces the ultimate family heirlooms, their eternal watchfulness both comfort and compass. Deep in the heart of Nubia's judicial system lay a practice so harrowing, it made trial by combat seem merciful, the poison oracle. When guilt was uncertain and stakes were high, Nubian elders turned to a brew so potent, its very consumption became the ultimate testimony. The accused would be handed a cup of toba, a vicious concoction steeped from the roots of the desert rose plant, its milky sap capable of stopping a human heart in minutes. But this wasn't random cruelty, it was sacred theater where the gods themselves played jury through the chemistry of survival. The rituals surrounding the poison trials were meticulously choreographed. Under the watchful eyes of priests wearing masks carved from hippopotamus ivory, the suspect would first inhale fumes of burning acacia, wood believed to sharpen the senses for divine communication. Then, as drummers pounded rhythms meant to mimic a faltering heartbeat, the cup was raised to the lips. Wall reliefs at Musawwar at Ease Safra show the critical moment frozen in stone. The accused's face contorted in anticipation, while elders lean forward to observe every twitch of the throat, every flutter of the eyelids. The smallest details held cosmic significance. If the drinker vomited within 7 breaths, innocence was declared. If they collapsed but later revived, guilt was assumed but mercy granted. Death, that was indisputable proof of wrongdoing, the body itself becoming the verdict. What's chilling is how deeply this practice was embedded in Nubian cosmology. Unlike European witch trials where torture preceded execution, the poison oracle was seen as a dialogue with the divine. The toba plant was called the tongue of Ammon, its effects believed to be controlled by the gods themselves. Modern toxicologists have analyzed residues in excavated oracle cups, confirming the brew contained not just dessert rose, but precise additives. Sometimes antidotal herbs like silphium, other times enhancers like scorpion venom, suggesting priests may have manipulated outcomes based on the accused's social standing or the crime's severity. The aftermath carried its own brutal poetry. Survivors had their foreheads branded with the Eye of Horus, a public mark of divine favor that barred retrial for life. The dead were denied burial rites, their bodies left in shallow pits near temple precincts as warnings. But the most unsettling discovery came from a Meroitic scroll describing the singing dead corpses that allegedly emitted high-pitched whistles when night winds passed through their rigor mortis, clenched teeth, interpreted as confessions from beyond the grave. Excavations at El Kuru uncovered a mass grave where skeletons were found with their jaws pried permanently open, perhaps to facilitate this ghastly phenomenon. Perhaps the most tragic participants were the children. In cases of alleged adultery, newborns were sometimes force-fed diluted toba to determine paternity. If they lived, the husband was deemed the father. If they died, the mother faced impalement. A collection of tiny ceramic feeding cups from Kerma, their interiors still stained with toxic alkaloids, stands as silent testimony to these horrific practices. Yet in Nubian belief, even this was an act of mercy, better a swift death than a life cursed by divine disapproval. The poison oracle wasn't abandoned until well into the Christian era, and even then, echoes remained. As late as the 19th century, Nubian caravan guides spoke of truth stones, pebbles heated in fire and placed on a suspect's tongue with blister patterns revealing guilt. In a land where the line between the physical and spiritual worlds was always thin, justice required more than human judgment. It demanded the irreversible, terrifying clarity of the divine. Beneath the shimmering beads and linen robes of Nubia's temple priestesses lay a secret language, one etched not on papyrus but directly onto flesh. These weren't mere decorations, they were sacred maps of power, intricate tattoos believed to transform the wearers into living vessels for goddesses like Isis and Hathor during ecstatic rituals. The process itself was a brutal baptism. Bone needles dipped in mixtures of soot, honey, and the menstrual blood of previous priestesses pierced the skin in spiraling patterns that mirrored celestial movements. Wall paintings at the Temple of Dhaka show initiates lying motionless as elder priestesses worked, their hands stained blue from the ink, their chants synced to the rhythmic tapping of the needles. The designs held terrifying potency. A serpent coiled around the navel marked the priestess as a conduit for Meretseja, the cobra goddess of vengeance, while intersecting triangles along the inner thighs invoked Ketesh's dominion over fertility and destruction. But the most sacred and perilous was the knot of Anat, a dense web of lines radiating from the pubic bone upwards, said to unleash divine frenzy when activated by ritual lovemaking. Greek traveler Strabo recounted witnessing a ceremony where tattooed priestesses drank hyena milk mixed with mandrake, their marked skin reportedly glowing as they channeled prophecies in voices not entirely human. Archaeology confirms these practices weren't metaphor. Mummified remains from Sedenga reveal priestesses with tattoos still visible after millennia, their lower backs branded with crescent moons, their breasts bearing faded hieroglyphs reading, "She who opens the womb of heaven." Chemical analysis shows some inks contained ground malachite and crushed lapis lazuli, minerals believed to vibrate at frequencies that attracted deities. The rituals these markings enabled were anything but chaste. During the annual festival of the inundation, selected priestesses would enter trance states induced by hallucinogenic henbane smoke, their tattoos reportedly pulsing as they performed sacred intercourse with carved obsidian idols. Wall fragments from Meroe depict scenes of such intensity that early archaeologists mistook them for pornography until they realized the hieroglyphic captions described these acts as literal mergers with the divine. One particularly vivid relief shows a priestess arched backward, her tattooed abdomen distended unnaturally as if something inside her were rearranging her very bones. But this privilege came at a cost. Priestesses who failed to enter trance states were subjected to the burning of the marks, their tattoos scorched off with hot bronze rods, effectively erasing their spiritual identity. Worse still were the rare accounts of unclean channeling, where a priestess allegedly became permanently possessed. The temple annals of Napata describe one such case where a woman's tattoos began spreading like vines across her body unchecked, her skin erupting in blisters that burst to reveal words not of any mortal tongue. She was sealed alive in a ritual pit, her final screams interpreted as the goddess Sekhmet's laughter. What makes these tattoos extraordinary isn't just their spiritual significance, but their defiance of decay. While most body art fades with time, these symbols were engineered for eternity. The ink recipes included powdered ibis bone and resin from trees that no longer exist, ingredients meant to bind the designs not just to skin but to the soul. Modern examinations using multispectral imaging have revealed tattoos invisible to the naked eye on priestesses' mummies, their patterns only appearing under specific light wavelengths, as if still waiting for the right ritual to reactivate them. In Nubia's priestess cult, the body wasn't just a temple, it was a living, breathing altar. its sacred graffiti an eternal invitation to forces beyond mortal comprehension. In the tombs of Nubian nobility, archaeologists have uncovered tiny golden vials so delicate they shimmer like trapped sunlight, but their contents reveal a mourning ritual more poetic than precious. These weren't vessels for perfume or medicine, they were containers for human tears, meticulously collected drop by drop during funeral rites. The belief was simple yet profound. Grief unmeasured by the gods was grief unheard in the afterlife. The practice unfolded with ceremonial precision. Mourners, especially women of high status, would kneel before the deceased for 40 days, their faces hovering over these ornate flasks. As tears fell, attendants used fine ivory spatulas to guide each droplet into the vial's narrow opening, a process depicted in tomb paintings at El Kuru with eerie tenderness. The most skilled tear catchers could distinguish between types of weeping. The first anguished sobs were considered too chaotic for collection, while the slow, crystalline tears of the seventh day held special potency, believed to crystallize into soul bridges in the underworld. Chemical analysis of residue inside excavated vials reveals startling complexity. Some contain traces of salt-tolerant barley enzymes, suggesting mourners may have consumed bitter herbs to alter their tears' composition. Others held microscopic gold flakes, possibly added during rituals where weeping women pressed golden discs to their eyelids, literally gilding their sorrow. The most heartbreaking finds come from child burials at Naga, where multiple vials were interred, each labeled with familial relationships: tears of the mother, tears of the milk brother, even tears of the royal cat. But the ritual's true power lay in its physics-defying mythology. Nubian funerary texts describe how these vials, once sealed and placed in the tomb, would gradually lighten as the deceased drank the tears in the afterlife. A stele from Mara recounts how Queen Amanita's tomb was reopened decades later, her golden vials found empty despite intact seals, proof her car had consumed the sorrow. Modern scans show something equally intriguing. Many vials contain intricate spiral grooves along their interiors, perhaps designed to accelerate evaporation as spiritual theater. The darkest variation occurred during times of war. When nobles died far from home, professional mourners called weepers of the absent would cut their own flesh to harvest tears mixed with blood, creating life-rich hybrids that ensured the fallen wouldn't wander the afterlife alone. At Jebel Barkal, archaeologists found a mass grave of soldiers buried with vials still containing these crimson clots, each corresponding to a wound described in battle records preserved on nearby ostraca. What seems macabre today was, for the Nubians, an act of sacred engineering, transforming something as ephemeral as grief into a tangible offering. Unlike cultures that feared emotional displays would haunt the dead, Nubians believed unmourned souls withered in the afterlife like unwatered crops. A mummy's worth wasn't measured in gold or lapis, but in the weight of tears buried beside it. The most poignant evidence, vials discovered in pauper graves, fashioned from reeds and clay but filled just as carefully, proof that in Nubia, even the poorest could send their love beyond death in something as simple as salt and gold. When the moon devoured the sun over ancient Nubia, panic didn't just ripple through the kingdom, it triggered rituals of unimaginable sacrifice. At the desert fortress of Jebel Sahaba, archaeologists uncovered a burial pit unlike any other. 27 children interred in a perfect circle, their small hands clutching miniature gold discs etched with solar flares. Carbon dating places their deaths precisely during the total solar eclipse of 1582 BCE, their bones arranged like spokes of a broken wheel aimed at the vanished sun. This wasn't random tragedy, it was calculated cosmic intervention. The Nubians saw eclipses as apocalyptic battles where the serpent god Apep swallowed Ra's solar bark whole. Texts from the Temple of Ammon at Napata describe panic so extreme, priests would sound elephant tusk trumpets to wake the sun from its slumber. But when noise and prayer failed, the kingdom resorted to its most horrific contingency. the offering of unshadowed souls, children who hadn't yet lived through enough cycles to cast darkness of their own. Excavations revealed chilling details. The victims were always firstborns between 7 and 12 years old, their teeth and fingernails painted with powdered carnelian to mimic the sun's hue, their throats slit with ceremonial obsidian blades shaped like crescent moons. What makes these sacrifices uniquely unsettling is their medical precision. CT scans of the remains show each child was drugged with a mixture of blue lotus and acacia bark, not to dull pain but to induce visions. Nubian astrologers believed the dying children's hallucinations became prophetic maps, their final cries revealing the serpent's weak points. A pottery shard from Kerma records one such prophecy. The beast's tail curls east when the small one screams of fiery birds, interpreted as instructions to burn ostrich plumes at specific temple altars. The aftermath was just as ritualized. As daylight returned, priests collected the children's blood in solar-shaped brass bowls, later mixing it with molten gold to forge amulets worn by kings. Their bodies were buried facing west, the direction of the underworld, with heavy stone spheres placed on their chests to anchor the sun's return. Modern astronomers have noted an eerie pattern. Many of these sacrificial sites align with eclipse paths centuries later, suggesting the Nubians may have tracked celestial cycles with terrifying accuracy. But the most heartbreaking evidence comes from the children themselves. Some skeletons show healed fractures from previous ritual trials, proving they'd been selected years in advance. Others were buried with toys, a carved hippopotamus here, a set of ivory dice there, as if their mourners hoped to comfort them in the afterlife. At the Museum of Sudanese Antiquities, one tiny skull still wears a copper circlet with an inscription, "You who gave your light so ours may continue." Was this desperation or devotion? The archaeological record suggests both. Soil analysis at multiple sacrifice sites reveals layers of burned grain and livestock bones beneath the child burials, evidence that animals and crops were offered first. Only when those failed did the priests turn to their ultimate currency, the future itself. In Nubia's eyes, the temporary death of the sun demanded permanent sacrifice, a transaction written not in ink or stone, but in the bones of the blameless. In the royal courts of Nubia, love wasn't a matter of the heart. It was a sacred geometry of bloodlines. Kings and queens of Kush didn't just marry their siblings by chance. They were bound by divine decree to replicate the union of Osiris and Isis, turning the palace into a closed circle of power where family trees grew inward rather than outward. This wasn't mere tradition, it was a theological blueprint ensuring rulers carried the pure, undiluted essence of the gods in their veins. But beneath the gilded symbolism lay a darker reality, a dynasty progressively poisoned by its own perfection. The ritual began with celestial calculations. When a royal heir reached maturity, priests would consult star charts to determine the most auspicious night for the sibling wedding, timed to coincide with the helical rising of Sirius. Wall carvings at Nuri depict the ceremony in eerie detail. The brother king standing barefoot on a leopard skin, his sister bride anointed with oil mixed with powdered meteorite, a literal fragment of the heavens to sanctify their union. Their hands were bound not with ribbons, but with strips of linen torn from the mummy wrappings of their ancestors, creating a tangible link between past, present, and future rulers. Yet the consequences of this divine mimicry were written in bones. Modern DNA analysis of royal mummies from El Karu reveals a genetic catastrophe unfolding over generations. One pharaoh, likely King Tantamani, shows evidence of extreme mandibular prognathism, the famous Habsburg jaw, centuries before European royalty, along with fused vertebrae that would have made turning his head agony. Another queen's remains tell an even grimmer story. Her pelvis shows deformities suggesting multiple stillbirths, while her child's skeleton displays a rare genetic disorder causing porous, honeycombed bones. The Nubians weren't blind to these horrors. Temple archives speak of the golden sickness, a constellation of ailments plaguing later dynasties' seizures attributed to the gods whispering too loudly in royal ears, chronic pain dismissed as the weight of the double crown. But the solution wasn't abandonment of the practice, it was escalation. By the Meroitic period, royal siblings were subjected to brutal purity tests before marriage. A newly discovered scroll from Wad Ban Nokka describes how prospective brides were locked in pitch-black chambers for 40 nights with only mummified ancestors for company. If she emerged speaking in coherent tongues, she was deemed sufficiently divine to wed. What makes this practice truly chilling is how it transformed parenthood into a sacred gamble. A 1st-century Greek ambassador's account tells of Queen Ammoniona's publicly nursing a visibly deformed infant, declaring its abnormalities were stars trapped in flesh. The child was later buried in a solid gold sarcophagus weighing more than the king's, its tiny body surrounded by vials of drugs that modern pharmacologists identify as early attempts at pain management: poppy extracts, cannabis resin, even traces of something resembling aspirin derived from willow bark. Archaeology reveals the ultimate irony. As the royal bloodline grew weaker, the rituals grew more extravagant. Later tombs contained staggering quantities of imported medicines, Roman glass vials still holding antimony-based potions, Chinese jade mortars for grinding rare herbs. The message is clear: a civilization that began by worshipping genetic purity ended up scouring the known world for ways to mitigate its consequences. The final Meroitic rulers were often depicted leaning on staffs or supported by attendants, their divine right to rule now literally propped up by foreign innovations. Perhaps the most poignant evidence comes not from grand tombs, but from humble clay amulets found in workers' quarters. These crude figurines show royal couples with exaggerated features, swollen brows, elongated limbs, suggesting commoners recognized the dynasty's physical decline even as they continued to venerate it. In Nubia, the god's perfect design had become a gilded cage, each generation inheriting not just a throne, but the accumulated sorrows of their ancestors. The same blood that made them divine also made them fragile, a living testament to the cruel arithmetic of power, that what strengthens a dynasty politically may weaken it biologically, until all that remains are bones whispering of choices made in the name of eternity. The rhythm of the drums wasn't just music in Nubia, it was a death sentence written in sweat and ecstasy. During the annual festival of the inundation, chosen dancers entered sacred circles where moving until collapse wasn't failure, but the ultimate devotion to the fertility gods. These weren't casual performances, they were meticulously choreographed acts of self-destruction, where the line between spiritual transport and physical expiration blurred into oblivion. Archaeologists at Kerma uncovered a temple courtyard lined with hundreds of shallow depressions, not from erosion but from the pounding of bare feet over centuries. The stones themselves bear grooves where dancers reportedly dragged their toes in final, spasming motions before death. Wall reliefs at Nokka show terrifying details, figures with ribcage protruding, their limbs twisted like reeds in a storm, eyes rolled back as priests chant over their convulsing bodies. The dancers drank a brew of fermented honey and desert ivy, a concoction modern chemists confirm contains stimulants strong enough to override the body's survival instincts. What makes these rituals uniquely chilling is their precision. Participants were selected years in advance, trained to endure through scarification rites that sliced tendons to increase flexibility. Texts from Mara describe a grading system. Those who died within 3 hours were merely accepted, while those who lasted beyond sunset achieved golden transcendence, their corpses mummified in dancing poses and displayed in temple niches as conduits for future blessings. One particularly gruesome stele recounts a dancer who continued moving for 2 days after his heart stopped, his decomposing limbs kept animated by muscle contractions from residual toxins. The aftermath was its own sacred theater. priestesses would collect the sweat of the fallen in ceremonial bowls, mixing it with Nile silt to create life paste smeared on barren women's bellies. Witnesses wrote of corpses smiling, their locked jaws requiring ritual breaking to extract the final laugh, believed to guarantee abundant harvests. But the darkest discovery came from a mass grave at Abu Hamd, where dancers' skeletons showed advanced osteoporosis, proof they'd been starved beforehand to quicken collapse, their fragile bones snapping like kindling in the ecstatic final moments. This wasn't mere spectacle, it was a brutal economy of faith. Drought years saw dozens of dancers perish in single ceremonies, their deaths calibrated like grisly rain gauges. A 7th century Greek merchant's account describes watching a queen join the dance, her jeweled collar growing heavier with each hour until she crumpled, her last breath used to bless the river itself. Modern excavations reveal some participants were buried with their stilts still lashed to broken legs, testament to dances so frenzied they continued even after bones shattered. In Nubia's eyes, the land's thirst could only be quenched by the sweat of the devoted, its fertility bought not with gold or grain, but with the last trembling steps of those who danced straight into the arms of the gods. When the Nile's floods failed and famine gripped Nubia, the kingdom didn't just pray, it staged a grisly performance where justice wore a lion's claws. The ritual began at the temple of Apidamak, where priests would anoint a volunteer, often a condemned criminal or aging warrior, with the regalia of kingship, a leopard skin cloak, a gilt wooden scepter, even a crown woven from sacred barley stalks. For 7 days, this false king lived in obscene luxury, gorging on roasted gazelle and date wine while the people starved. Then, at the new moon, the pantomime ended. Stripped of his ornaments and smeared with sheep's blood to mimic wounds, the impostor was released into a walled arena where starved lions waited, their roars echoing across the silent city. This wasn't random savagery, it was cosmic accounting. Nubian theology held that failed harvests signaled divine displeasure at royal corruption, but since killing an actual monarch would invite chaos, the kingdom devised a horrifying loophole. By creating a symbolic ruler whose death could cleanse the throne, they satisfied the gods without destabilizing the state. Wall carvings at Musawwar depict the ritual's eerie choreography. Lions with ceremonial gold caps on their fangs, priests reading the dying man's convulsions like omens, and the crowd's reaction determining whether the sacrifice was accepted. A surviving temple ledger from Mara records 1 year where the lions refused to attack until the false king was flogged. Interpreted as proof, the gods demanded harsher punishments for hoarding grain. The logistics were as precise as they were brutal. Lions were captured months in advance and kept in darkness to heighten aggression, while the false king underwent rituals to transfer the kingdom's sins onto his body, scourging with salt-encrusted reeds, swallowing tablets inscribed with curses, even wearing a mask painted with the current pharaoh's likeness. Greek historian Diodorus Siculus wrote of attending a ceremony where the victim's fingertips were severed first, a deliberate echo of Nubian tax collectors lopping off fingers from delinquent farmers. The lions themselves weren't mere executioners, they were divine avengers. After the kill, priests would collect their dung to mix with seed grain, believing the beast's sacred fury could fertilize barren fields. Archaeology reveals how deeply this ritual permeated Nubian consciousness. At Noga, excavators found a lion cub buried with a golden mane, likely a temple-raised animal trained for the rite, its skeleton showing filed teeth to prolong the victim's agony. Nearby, a false king's mummy was discovered with his spinal cord neatly severed in 5 places, suggesting some hunts were carefully staged tortures disguised as animal attacks. The most chilling find, a storage jar filled with lion claws, each inscribed with a year of famine and the name of the sacrificed stand-in, proving the ritual spanned centuries. But the practice's true horror lay in its psychological precision. by making the entire population complicit, cheering as the lions advanced, then scattering the victims' ashes on their fields. The ritual transformed collective guilt into collective catharsis. A 1st-century merchant's letter describes children being given lion-shaped honey cakes afterward, their sweetness masking the taste of blood still hanging in the air. Modern scholars note the parallels to other scapegoat traditions worldwide, but Nubia's version stands apart in its theatrical cruelty. The false king wasn't just killed, he was unmade, his brief reign rewritten as a cautionary tale etched in tooth and claw. Even in death, his role wasn't over. Fragments of his bones were often ground into amulets to ward off future death, turning the sacrifice into a perpetual guardian. The ritual only ended when Christianity reached Nubia, but its shadow lingered. As late as the 12th century, drought-stricken villages would parade an effigy through fields before burning it, calling the act feeding the invisible lions. In a land where nature's mercy was never guaranteed, the line between ruler and prey remained terrifyingly thin, a lesson written not in ink or stone, but in the moment when a golden crown rolled bloody across the sand and a hungry lion lifted its head to the cheering crowd. In the sacred courtyards of Nubia's temples, a gesture so mundane it's offensive in most cultures became the ultimate conduit for divine power: spitting. But this wasn't crude disrespect, it was a calculated act of spiritual transfer where a priest's saliva carried the very breath of the gods. When high priests of Ammon leaned over crowds during festivals, their mouths filled not with curses, but with consecrated water and ground barley, they weren't merely blessing the people. They were physically implanting fragments of their own life force into worshippers' skin. The rituals surrounding sacred spitting were anything but casual. Before each ceremony, priests underwent 40 days of purification, eating only white foods like milk and rice to brighten their saliva, while avoiding garlic or onions that might taint the divine current. Wall paintings at the Temple of Solub show the moment frozen in time. Priests with cheeks puffed, heads thrown back, their spit arcing through the air in golden-hued droplets that temple artists deliberately painted to resemble falling stars. The targets, usually newborns, brides, or warriors heading to battle, would stand bare-chested, their skin prepped with a sticky resin made from acacia gum so the saliva would adhere like liquid sanctity. What makes this practice extraordinary is the science behind the superstition. Modern analysis of temple reliefs reveals priests held specific plants under their tongues to alter their spit's composition. Blue lotus petals provided mild sedatives for anxious recipients, while powdered malachite added antimicrobial properties, an accidental health benefit masked as mysticism. One particularly brilliant fresco at Kawa depicts a priest spitting into a potter's clay, a symbolic act believed to transfer creative energy. Archaeologists later found that very vessel, its rim still bearing the faint imprint of lips from 3,000 years ago. The most potent spitting ceremonies occurred during royal coronations. Newly crowned pharaohs of Kush would receive what texts call the sevenfold spit. 7 priests representing different gods would expectorate onto the ruler's forehead, chest, and palms in a choreographed sequence. The Nubian Book of the Dead describes the ideal consistency: thick as honey for permanence, sparkling as dawn dew for vitality. Failure to achieve this balance was catastrophic. One Meroitic scroll recounts a priest whose saliva was deemed too watery during a king's blessing, resulting in his tongue being ritually pierced with a silver needle. But the darkest variation involved mourning rites. When a family couldn't afford mummification, they'd hire weeping spitters, professional mourners who cried directly onto the corpse's face for days, their tears and saliva mixing to form a makeshift preservative coating. Excavations at tombos revealed skeletons with strangely eroded cheekbones, not from decay, but from the acidic buildup of countless spit applications over months of funerary rituals. Some skulls still held desiccated clumps of this bizarre organic plaster between their teeth, a final earthy communion between the living and the dead. Far from primitive behavior, this was sacred biochemistry in action. Nubian medical texts prescribe priestly spit for everything from snakebites to infertility, with precise instructions like must be taken from a fasting priest at the 3rd hour after sunrise. The most compelling evidence comes from a leather pouch found in a healer's tomb inside. Dozens of tiny reed tubes filled with different priests' dried saliva, carefully labeled with symptoms they allegedly cured. Modern DNA testing revealed several samples contained an enzyme now known to stimulate tissue regeneration, suggesting ancient healers unknowingly harnessed biological properties science wouldn't rediscover for millennia. Perhaps the most poignant legacy of this practice survives in modern Nubian wedding traditions, where elders still lightly moisten their thumbs to trace blessings on a bride's forehead, a whispered echo of the belief that the human body itself is the original reliquary, capable of storing and transmitting miracles in something as simple as a drop of spit. What we dismiss as vulgar, they venerated as vitality itself, the ultimate alchemy, transforming mundane bodily fluids into vessels for the divine. When the future grew too dark for even Nubia's star readers to decipher, priests turned to creatures whose black fur held the very essence of the underworld, puppies barely weaned, their coats as night-colored as Anubis's sacred jackals. This wasn't random brutality, it was a brutal calculus of divination where the smooth, unmarked entrails of young dogs were believed to mirror the untainted truth of the gods. The ritual, called the opening of the moon road, began at midnight in torchlit temple crypts where priests would line up 6 black puppies, one for each direction of the winds, their whimpers silenced with honeyed milk laced with lotus to sweeten the message. The slaughter itself was a sacred geometry. Using a curved obsidian blade shaped like the crescent moon, the high priest would slit each puppy's belly in a single upward stroke, mimicking Anubis's role as opener of the afterlife. The steaming entrails were then laid on a silver platter engraved with celestial maps, their positions interpreted with terrifying specificity. A liver resting northeast meant abundant floods, intestines coiled in a spiral warned of royal betrayal. At Musawwar at East Sufra, archaeologists found a divination chamber with drainage channels still stained with iron oxide, not from human sacrifice but from centuries of puppy blood funneled into offering pits beneath the temple. What makes this practice uniquely unsettling is the meticulous record-keeping. Clay tablets from Kerma detail how certain litters were bred exclusively for divination. Their mothers fed a diet of Nile perch and juniper berries to purify their offspring's organs. One ledger lists 37 puppies sacrificed over a single drought year, their entrail patterns cross-referenced with later historical events, a grisly spreadsheet of cause and effect. The most chilling discovery, a puppy mummy from Sedenga, its body stuffed with myrrh and cumin, its stomach cavity hollowed out and packed with inscribed papyrus strips, likely a divination manual buried with its tiny oracle. The rituals didn't end with reading. The puppies' bodies were treated with macabre reverence. Their skulls, once scraped clean, became rattles for rain dances. Their pelts were stitched into cloaks worn by judges during treason trials, believed to channel Anubis's impartial justice. A 1st-century Roman trader's account describes witnessing a priest wear a belt made of puppy teeth, each one inscribed with the outcome it had predicted, a grotesque ledger swinging at his hips. But the darkest twist lay in the living omens. If a puppy's heart continued beating after removal, a phenomenon modern science attributes to residual nerve activity, it was placed in a bronze bowl and carried through Thebes as a prophetic relic. Wall carvings at Naka show such a heart, improbably still pulsing in its dish, surrounded by priests holding measuring rods to track its quivers like some grotesque celestial seismograph. The record shows one such heart supposedly beat for 3 days, its rhythm dictating military campaigns until it finally stilled, coinciding exactly with a Kushite victory over Ptolemaic forces. What seems like senseless cruelty was, in Nubian theology, the ultimate act of interspecies communion. These puppies weren't just killed, they were transformed into bridges between realms, their brief lives ending as vessels for divine speech. Modern excavations reveal their graves clustered near temple library annexes, as if the Nubians themselves acknowledged these animals as the ultimate scribes, their spilled innards inking prophecies more permanent than any papyrus. Today, the faint paw prints pressed into wet clay bricks at Mara's ruins stand as silent witnesses to a belief system where truth wasn't written in stars or stones, but in the glistening, rearranged viscera of creatures too young to understand their sacred doom. When the Nile's floodwaters receded each year, leaving the black earth ripe for planting, Nubia unleashed an explosion of sanctioned chaos, the festival of drunkenness. This wasn't just a night of excessive drinking, it was a deliberate unraveling of the social order where slaves commanded masters, children judged elders, and the sober became the outcast. At the Temple of Mut in Kawa, priests distributed vats of beer so potent Greek historians claimed a single cup could blind a man for days. The brew, nicknamed the Tears of Hathor, was thickened with honey, dates, and something far more sinister, a hallucinogenic fungus harvested from rotten grain, ensuring participants didn't just get drunk, they plummeted into full-blown delirium. The rules of the festival were as precise as they were perverse. For exactly 12 hours, marked by water clocks stained red to resemble blood, every law but one was suspended. No violence that left permanent injury. Beyond that, chaos reigned. Tax collectors stripped naked and danced through the streets while citizens pelted them with rotten fruit. Wives shaved their husbands' heads in public, then auctioned the hair to bidders who believed it held fertility magic. Most shocking of all were the truth trials, where intoxicated peasants could accuse officials of corruption without evidence. If the accused vomited before denying the claim, they were immediately stripped of rank. Wall paintings at Wad Ban Naka depict judges swaying on their benches, their wigs askew as they pronounced verdicts in slurred speech, while scribes struggled to record proceedings on clay tablets later found smeared with ale. But the festival's true purpose wasn't mere debauchery, it was a pressure valve for a society welded shut by rigid hierarchy. Anthropologists note how the ritual mirrored the Nile's own duality, life-giving yet destructive, predictable yet uncontrollable. The Nubians understood that to prevent true revolution, they needed to simulate it annually under divine sanction. The most revelatory archaeological find came from a brewery at Marawe, where excavators uncovered jugs labeled with hieroglyphs translating to "for the breaking of minds." Residue analysis revealed traces of Datura stramonium, a plant causing waking nightmares, proof that some participants were chemically thrust into altered states to see the world as the gods do. The aftermath was its own ritual. Those who passed out were dragged to recovery courtyards and arranged in precise zodiacal patterns, believed to harness celestial energy for their rebirth into sobriety. Many awoke to find their bodies painted with mocking caricatures of their social roles. A general might discover his chest adorned with chicken feathers, a priestess with her lips stained blue to mimic a baboon's backside. These illustrations weren't just jokes, they served as year-long reminders of humility. What fascinates modern scholars isn't the excess but the control beneath it. Broken pottery shards found near festival grounds show meticulous tallies, so many cups per district, so many injuries requiring stitches. This was chaos with spreadsheets. Even the drunks had roles. Some were designated howlers to imitate jackals, others stumblers who reenacted the Nile's meandering path. The festival's closing ceremony involved feeding the unconscious masses a concoction of raw eggs and crocodile bile to induce vomiting, a collective purification before order was restored at dawn. The darkest accounts come from Roman observers who misinterpreted the event as mere barbarism. One wrote of seeing a merchant prince grovel before his own camel driver, only to reclaim his status the next morning by ceremonially washing the man's feet, an act that would have meant social suicide any other day. But in Nubia's eyes, this temporary inversion wasn't sacrilege. It was sacred, a reminder that no hierarchy was divine except the gods themselves. Modern excavations at Danjel revealed a cellar where festival masks were stored, some carved with the faces of past kings, their mouths stretched into grotesque grins, as if laughter itself could be a weapon against tyranny. Perhaps the most poignant legacy of this festival survives in Sudanese folk traditions, where elders still playfully threaten misbehaving children with the return of the drunkard's moon. In a civilization that perfected the art of control, this one night of calculated madness stood as proof that even the most rigid societies need to occasionally loosen the ropes, if only to remember why they were tied in the first place. In the shadow of Nubia's bustling marketplaces, justice wasn't just served, it was mounted on spikes for all to see. Thieves caught stealing grain, gold, or even a single loaf of bread faced a punishment far more grotesque than mere imprisonment. Their ears were severed with ceremonial bronze sickles, the same tools used to harvest wheat, turning the act into a grim metaphor. What they'd stolen with their hands, they repaid with their flesh. But this wasn't just about retribution. It was a chilling blend of magical deterrent and public spectacle, where amputated ears became both warning and ward against future crimes. The ritual began at dawn when the heat was still bearable. Condemned thieves were paraded through the streets with their hands bound in ropes soaked in tamarind juice, a stinging reminder of the sweetness they'd tried to take. At the city gates, priests would chant spells from the Book of the Dead over the blades, invoking Maat, goddess of justice, to guide the cuts. The slicing itself was methodical. First the right ear, symbolizing the theft's physical act, then the left, representing the lie of denial. Archaeologists at Kerma uncovered a collection of these sickles, their edges honed razor-sharp and still bearing traces of human tissue in the crevices. What happened next was even more macabre. The ears weren't discarded, they were threaded onto copper wires and hung above the city gates like grotesque wind chimes. Nubian legal texts describe this as the whispering wall, believing the severed ears would magically vibrate whenever a thief passed beneath, alerting guards. A 1st century Greek merchant's account tells of entering a Kushite city and seeing hundreds of desiccated ears clattering in the wind, some so old they'd turned to leathery husks. The most disturbing detail, fresh ears were displayed at eye level, still glistening, while older ones dangled higher up, creating a grisly timeline of justice served. But the punishment didn't end at mutilation. Thieves were then forced to wear thick linen hoods for 40 days, partly to protect the festering wounds, but mostly to brand them as outcasts. The hoods were dyed ochre red and stitched with crude eye holes, making wearers instantly recognizable. Wall carvings at Napata show these hooded figures hauling stones for temple construction, their identities erased but their shame magnified. Curiously, some hoods discovered in tombs bear intricate embroidery, suggesting a twisted form of pity, perhaps added by family members who couldn't bear to see their loved ones utterly nameless. The magical aspect of this practice was deadly serious. Ears were considered the body's truth chambers, where oaths were heard and stored. By removing them, the Nubians believed they were stripping thieves of their capacity to lie ever again. A cache of amulets found at Mara contains tiny gold ears inscribed with curses, likely worn by victims of theft to symbolically reclaim what was taken. Even the positioning of the displayed ears held meaning, facing inward toward the city as a warning to residents, or outward to deter foreign thieves depending on the crime. The most unsettling discovery came from a guard tower at Semna. Beneath its foundation, archaeologists found a pottery jar packed with ear bones, the tiny ossicles that transmit sound. Each was drilled with a hole, suggesting they'd been worn as charms by lockkeepers. A papyrus scrap nearby explains, "He who wears the thief's hearing shall never be deceived." Modern forensic analysis revealed these bones came from at least 200 individuals, some showing signs of having been pried out while the victim still lived. This practice wasn't just about fear, it was a perverse form of social engineering. By making theft visible in such a visceral way, Nubians turned justice into a shared sensory experience. The clatter of dried ears in the wind, the metallic stench of blood on the gates, the sight of hooded figures shuffling through dust, these were constant reminders that crime didn't just harm individuals, it scarred the community's very fabric. The echoes of this brutality lingered long after Nubia's decline. Medieval Sudanese markets sometimes displayed severed donkey ears as symbolic deterrents, and even today, some Sudanese Arabic dialects use the phrase "gate's necklace" to describe someone who's been publicly shamed. In a civilization without prisons or written laws, punishment had to be unforgettable, and in Nubia, nothing stuck in memory like the sight of human ears turning to leather under the relentless African sun. When love crossed the boundary between the living and the dead in ancient Nubia, it wasn't considered tragedy, it was sacrament. The phantom bride ceremony transformed grief into eternal union, binding widows and widowers to departed spouses through weddings more elaborate than those of the living. These weren't symbolic gestures, they were legally binding contracts witnessed by priests, sealed with dowries, and consummated in ways that blurred the line between devotion and the supernatural. The rituals began with a negotiation as precise as any earthly marriage. The bereaved would present gifts to the deceased's family, often mirrors of electrum to reflect the spirit's face, or linen soaked in the Nile to weave the couple's afterlife shroud. At Kawa, archaeologists uncovered a bridal contract etched on ostrich eggshell, detailing how a merchant's son would wed the daughter of the Western Sands, a poetic term for a girl who'd perished in a dust storm. Her dowry included 3 golden needles to mend the veil between worlds, and a jar of perfume that, when opened decades later, still released the faintest scent of myrrh. What followed was a nuptial spectacle unlike any other. The living partner wore garments dyed half black, half white, symbolizing their dual existence across realms. Instead of exchanging rings, they slipped golden threads through the nose piercing of the mummy, or, if the body was lost, tied them around a car statue containing the deceased's hair. Wall paintings at Mara depict the climax, the couple's hands joined not by ribbon, but by the intestines of a freshly sacrificed ram, still warm and glistening, to signify unbreakable bonds in this life and the next. Consummation took place in specially constructed bridal chambers within temple complexes. The living spouse would lie beside an effigy wrapped in the deceased's clothing, its face smeared with a paste made from the mummy's ground bones and honey. Texts from Jebel Barkal describe spirit torches burning with oil infused with the dead's fingernail clippings, their flickering shadows interpreted as the phantom's approving movements. Some accounts speak of cold drafts inexplicably extinguishing certain flames while leaving others burning reed as the deceased's selective participation in the rites. The aftermath was its own sacred theater. For 40 nights, the living partner slept with a clay voice pot beneath their pillow, a vessel shaped like the deceased's mouth into which they whispered private words. On the final morning, priests would seal the pot and bury it at a crossroads, believing the whispers would guide the phantom spouse between worlds during conjugal visits. Excavations at Sedenga unearthed dozens of these pots, some still bearing lip marks on their rims, others containing tiny scrolls with messages like, "Your side of the bed stays cold," or "Come when the ibis calls." But the most haunting evidence comes from child phantom brides. At a necropolis near Tombos, archaeologists found the mummy of a 12-year-old girl buried in adult bridal regalia, her skeletal arms clutching a doll with features eerily resembling a young man interred nearby. Inscriptions revealed she'd been wed posthumously to a boy who drowned trying to save her during a flood, their families uniting them in death to prevent lonely afterlives. The girl's mummy showed traces of henna on its fingers, applied during the ceremony centuries after her actual death. This practice wasn't just romantic, it was pragmatic. Nubian inheritance laws treated phantom spouses as legal entities, allowing property to pass seamlessly between realms. A widow could tend her spectral husband's lands without remarrying, a concept that baffled Roman historians but made perfect sense along the Nile. The darkest twist, some phantom marriages were compulsory. Scrolls from Nuri describe orphaned children, wed to wealthy ancestors to secure their fortunes, living their lives with golden figurines as bedmates. Modern excavations continue to unveil the intimacy of these unions. At a Meroitic tomb, researchers found two skeletons, one centuries older than the other, lying side by side, their finger bones carefully interlaced by mourners during the phantom wedding. The younger skeleton's ribcage cradled a terracotta heart inscribed with a phrase that captures the essence of this practice: "You left my world, but never my bed." In Nubia, death wasn't the end of love, just the beginning of a marriage conducted in whispers, shadows, and the quiet certainty that some bonds even the underworld couldn't sever. In the royal courts of Nubia, thinness wasn't just unfashionable, it was treasonous. Kings of Kush underwent a terrifying transformation before coronation, their bodies deliberately swollen to grotesque proportions through a ritualized process called the fattening of the sun. This wasn't mere gluttony, it was a sacred metamorphosis where every stretch mark became a divine inscription, every roll of flesh proof of the god's favor. Wall carvings at Nuri depict the brutal regimen, royal attendants forcing honeyed goat milk through golden tubes into the king's mouth as he lay immobilized on cushions, his limbs rubbed with sesame oil to prevent cracking skin. The science behind this practice was as precise as it was cruel. Nubian physicians developed a gruel of fermented sorghum, crushed dates, and ground elephant ivory, a concoction modern nutritionists estimate at over 5,000 calories per bowl. Servants fed this to rulers hourly, even during sleep, using polished bone spoons to prevent gagging. But the true horror lay in the additives. Scrolls from Mara describe mixing in powdered river clay to stretch the stomach and distilled palm wine to numb resistance. Excavations at El Kuru revealed a pharaoh's burial with his internal organs preserved separately, his stomach enlarged to 3 times normal size, its walls thinned like overworked dough. This forced obesity served a terrifying political theology. In a land where famine was never distant, a king's girth proved his ability to command abundance. The fatter the ruler, the more convincing his claim to be the living incarnation of Hapi, the Nile's fertility god. A 7th century Greek ambassador's account describes meeting King Anlamoni, who reportedly needed 6 men to roll him onto his throne each morning, his belly draped over the armrests like golden dough over a baker's table. The ambassador noted with horror how the king's attendants would pin his skin folds with jeweled clasps to prevent chafing during audiences. The rituals surrounding this transformation were meticulously cruel. Each new moon, priests measured the king's waist with a sacred cord woven from hippopotamus hide, marking growth in cubits on the temple walls. Failure to expand meant escalating punishments, first the flogging of his food tasters, then the public roasting of his favorite pets, and finally, if the next measurement still disappointed, the king's own brothers were force-fed in his place while he watched, stripped of titles. A relief at Musawwar at Es Sufra shows one such humiliated monarch, his now slender figure carved smaller than his bloated siblings, his crown hovering ominously above another's head. But the most disturbing evidence comes from the royal kitchens. Archaeologists at Napata uncovered massive ceramic vats still containing traces of a ghastly paste rendered human fat mixed with palm oil, likely skimmed from the corpses of previous kings and fed to their successors as ancestral essence. This cannibalistic recycling created a nightmarish continuity. Each ruler quite literally carried the weight of his forebears. Modern DNA analysis of a Meroitic queen's mummy revealed signs of extreme fatty liver disease, her organs marbled like overworked livestock at just 28 years of age. The practice's psychological toll was equally devastating. Court poets wrote of kings weeping silently as attendants massaged lard into their distended abdomens, or begging for just one day without the golden feeding tubes. One poignant ostracon from Sedenga contains a child prince's scribbles crude drawings of his father growing progressively rounder, the final image showing the man as a featureless sphere with tiny, drowning hands. When these kings finally died, their fat became its own relic. Embalmers carefully rendered their excess flesh into sacred oils used to anoint future rulers, creating a vicious cycle where each generation grew larger than the last. The tomb of King Tallakamani contained jars labeled the Holy Grease, their contents still emitting a sickly sweet odor after millennia. In Nubia's theology, a king's bulk wasn't just his glory. It was his people's salvation, a living sacrifice of mobility and comfort to prove the gods still smiled upon the land. Even in death, their sarcophagi had to be carved wider than standard dimensions, their eternal rest a prison of their own golden flesh. The gold mines of Napata weren't just sources of wealth, they were gulfs of blasphemy waiting to swallow the unwary. Hidden deep in the desert mountains, these veins of sacred metal pulsed through Nubian spirituality like forbidden arteries, their extraction governed by taboos so severe, even kings hesitated to breach them. This wasn't ordinary gold, it was the flesh of Ra, believed to be the crystallized sweat of the sun god himself, flecked with divine essence. To mine it carelessly wasn't theft, it was cosmic mutilation. Legends tell of the city of Ducky Gel, once a bustling mining hub, erased from history in a single night. According to temple inscriptions, its workers had grown greedy, tunneling too close to a sacred vein on the eve of the summer solstice. The punishment was biblical. Sandstorms howled in from a clear sky, burying every structure up to the rooftops, while those who fled were said to wander the desert as glowing, gold-skinned wraiths. Archaeologists surveying the area centuries later found the ruins eerily intact, abandoned meals still rotting in clay bowls, sandals lined up beside mine shafts as if their owners had simply evaporated. The most chilling discovery, a half-carved statue of Ammon, its face melted into a featureless blob, its base inscribed with a warning: "The sun's anger cannot be quenched by mortal hands." The rituals surrounding this gold were as precise as they were petrifying. Only priest-sanctioned miners, always left-handed, believed to be less susceptible to greed, could enter the shafts after days of purification. They worked in total silence, their tools wrapped in ibis leather to muffle strikes, their bodies smeared with ash to mask human scent. Any gold extracted had to be cooled in vats of milk before crafting, a process depicted in temple reliefs where the metal visibly steamed upon contact, as if rejecting mortal touch. Even then, most was reserved for divine statuary. A single gram of unauthorized personal use carried a sentence of being buried alive with molten gold poured into the ears, a punishment called the God's Whisper. But the deadliest taboo involved the veins of tears, gold deposits streaked with red iron oxide resembling blood. These were believed to be Ra's sorrow made tangible, and disturbing them invited generational curses. A papyrus from Meroe recounts an entire dynasty wiped out after a queen commissioned earrings from such ore, her line perishing one by one from boiling blood, their skin reportedly splitting open like overripe fruit under the desert sun. Modern geologists confirm these deposits contained unusually high levels of arsenic, suggesting the curse had a grim scientific basis. The mine's final guardians were the gold wives, women ritually married to the metal itself. Chosen for their barrenness, they lived celibate lives atop the mines, their hair braided with golden threads that allegedly vibrated when trespassers approached. Upon death, their corpses were stuffed with raw nuggets and entombed vertically in the shafts, forever standing watch. At Napata's abandoned mines, excavators found one such mummy still clutching a hammer in skeletal fingers, her skull filled not with brain matter, but with a single, massive gold bead, the ultimate keeper turned kept. What modern prospectors dismiss as superstition, the Nubians understood as ecological foresight. The arsenic-laden ore poisoned careless miners, and the desert's shifting sands swallowed overambitious operations whole. Their taboos weren't just spiritual safeguards, they were a survival manual written in blood and legend, where the earth's riches came with invisible fine print. Today, the cursed gold still glitters faintly in unmarked crevices, waiting for fools bold enough to test whether the god's wrath has a statute of limitations. Deep in the incense-choked halls of Nubia's serpent temples, the gods didn't speak through priests, they hissed through the flickering tongues of sacred cobras. These weren't mere symbols of divinity, they were living conduits for prophecy, their drug-induced writhings transformed into celestial messages by handlers fluent in the language of scales and venom. The ritual began at dusk when the desert cooled and the snakes grew restless. Priests would anoint each cobra's head with an unguent made from crushed blue lotus, fermented dates, and a secret ingredient modern chemists have identified as a neurotoxic compound from the boomslang snake, a cocktail designed to induce tremors without killing the reptile. Witnesses describe the ceremony in hushed terror. The serpents, normally kept in alabaster pits, were lifted onto bronze tripods shaped like coiled asps, their bodies draped over heated stones to amplify their movements. As the drugs took effect, their undulations became increasingly erratic head tilts interpreted as warnings of drought, rapid tongue flicks signaling impending royal betrayals. A 1st century Roman diplomat's account tells of a priestess plunging her bare arm into a mass of thrashing cobras, her shrill cries translating their convulsions into verse. When the Golden One strikes east, the Nile's children will feast on each other's flesh. But the true horror lay in the handler's precision. Temple murals at Naga show priests with forked rods, gently guiding the snakes into specific patterns, figure 8s for fertility predictions, tight spirals for military counsel. Forensic analysis of these rods revealed microscopic grooves along their lengths, suggesting they may have been dipped in psychoactive substances to further influence the serpent's behavior. The most skilled interpreters could allegedly distinguish between prophecies meant for public consumption and those reserved for royal ears alone, based solely on whether the cobra's left or right eye remained open during its trance. The aftermath was as calculated as the ritual itself. Cobras that survived multiple ceremonies developed distinctive scarring along their bellies from the heated stones. These veterans were called the Scriptured Ones and buried in their own miniature pyramids. Those that died mid-prophecy were mummified with their mouths propped open, forever frozen, hissing warnings to the afterlife. Archaeologists at Danjel discovered one such mummy with a papyrus scroll crammed down its throat, its contents detailing a failed assassination plot against a Meroitic queen, proof that sometimes the snake's predictions were deadly accurate. What modern herpetologists find most astonishing isn't the cruelty, but the biological insight behind it. The Nubians somehow recognized that cobras' nervous systems produce distinct movement patterns under different toxins knowledge science wouldn't rediscover until the 20th century. Today, the faint hiss of a desert wind through ruined temple columns still carries echoes of a time when truth wasn't written in ink or stone, but in the hypnotic dance of poisoned serpents swaying between revelation and oblivion. When the solstice winds howled across Nubia's deserts, priests climbed to the highest temple terraces carrying instruments, unlike any other flutes whittled from the very bones of their ancestors. These weren't mere memorials, they were sonic bridges to the afterlife, each crafted from a human femur with chilling precision. The process began with selecting the singing bone, always from a bard or royal poet who'd shown exceptional vocal talent in life. Using obsidian blades, artisans would hollow out the marrow cavity while chanting the deceased's favorite verses, transforming dense thigh bones into haunting wind instruments capable of melodies no living throat could replicate. The solstice ritual unfolded under blood-red skies, 12 flutes, one for each month of the year, were arranged in a circle representing the cycle of death and rebirth. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the high priest would blow a single, wavering note through the oldest flute, its tone deeper from centuries of use. Wall carvings at Kawa depict this moment frozen in time, priests with cheeks bulging as if the ancestors themselves were exhaling through them, while shadows lengthened into spirals around the musicians. Greek historian Diodorus Siculus wrote of hearing the sound firsthand, like a chorus of ghosts sighing through cracked teeth, and noted how even desert foxes would stop to howl in response. What made these instruments truly terrifying was their construction. Microscopic analysis of surviving flutes reveals meticulous tuning holes drilled at mathematically precise intervals to mimic the harmonic range of the original owner's voice. Some even retained fragments of the deceased's mummified tissue inside the bone, deliberately left to flavor the sound. The most macabre example, housed in the British Museum, still bears teeth marks from its first player's mortal life, grooves worn into the bone from decades of the bard nervously chewing his flute between performances, now forever silencing his own melodies. The rituals reached their crescendo at midnight. Priests would pass the flutes in a counterclockwise spiral, each adding a layer to the dissonant symphony until the air throbbed with overlapping notes. Nubian star charts suggest this cacophony wasn't random. Certain constellations were believed to resonate with specific tones, and the chaos was meant to tune the heavens themselves. A cache of scribbled notes found at Mara details how one high priest adjusted his playing when Sirius appeared, producing a shrill, ululating note that reportedly made temple dogs convulse. After effects of these ceremonies lingered like auditory ghosts. Some participants claimed to hear the flute songs echoing in their dreams for years, while others developed bone fever, a condition marked by an obsession with the deceased musician's life. Excavations at Sedenga uncovered a noblewoman's tomb filled with hundreds of reed flutes, all snapped in half. Inscriptions revealed she'd spent her final years trying and failing to replicate her great-grandmother's femur melody on conventional instruments before dying of self-imposed starvation, her ears stuffed with beeswax to silence the phantom music. Perhaps the most unsettling discovery came from a mass grave near the Fourth Cataract. 37 skeletons lay arranged in a spiral, each missing a femur. At the center stood a single bone flute, its surface inscribed with a phrase that chills modern archaeologists: "We are all instruments waiting to be played." In Nubia's eyes, death wasn't an end, just a transition from vocal cords to wind instruments, where the departed could still sing through the living, one shuddering note at a time. When the dry season's heat reached its peak and the Nile's waters ran lowest, Nubian families gathered for a ritual that would make modern morticians shudder: the night of skull polishing. This wasn't mere housekeeping for the dead. It was a sacred rejuvenation where ancestral skulls were exhumed, scrubbed, and repainted with colors so vibrant they supposedly pulsed with renewed magic under the moonlight. The ceremony began at twilight, when the boundary between worlds grew thin enough to hear the faintest whisper from beyond. Each household kept their ancestors' skulls in woven baskets lined with leopard fur, stored in underground chambers to preserve their potency. As the first stars appeared, the eldest living relative would lift these cranial relics with trembling hands, their surfaces darkened by decades of sacred oils and candle smoke. Using sponges carved from Nile crocodile cartilage chosen for its abrasive yet forgiving texture, they'd meticulously scrape away the old paint, revealing the bone beneath. Wall carvings at Karanog show the delicate process, children holding oil lamps while elders worked, their tools reflecting the firelight like surgical instruments in some macabre operating theater. The repainting that followed was no random act of decoration. Every color held specific power: ochre for fertility, lapis blue for protection against evil spirits, and a terrifying crimson made from crushed carnelian mixed with bull's blood to restore warrior vigor. Archaeologists at Questol discovered a set of ceremonial paints still sealed in ostrich eggshell containers, their pigment so fresh after 2 millennia they left streaks on modern gloves. But the most chilling detail, some skulls showed evidence of being repainted dozens of times over centuries, their surfaces layered like the rings of a tree, each hue slightly shifted to reflect changing family fortunes. As the night deepened, the rituals grew more intense. Priestesses would brew a hallucinogenic tea from desert thyme and pour it directly into the skull's eye sockets, believing the liquid carried messages to the afterlife as it seeped through bone. Greek traveler Aristides witnessed one such ceremony in the 2nd century, describing how the empty cranial cavities emitted eerie whistling sounds as wind passed through them, interpreted as ancestral approval. Modern acousticians replicating the phenomenon found certain skulls had been deliberately thinned in specific areas to produce distinct tones, essentially tuning them like musical instruments for the dead. The climax came at midnight when the polished skulls were arranged in formation to catch the zenith moon's light. A cache of clay tablets from pharaohs details the precise configuration: circles for peacekeeping ancestors, jagged lines for warrior spirits. Some families went further, embedding the skulls with fresh gemstones in their teeth sockets or drilling tiny holes to thread gold wire through old fractures, physically repairing their forebears as if mortality itself could be undone with craftsmanship. But the true horror lay in the consequences of neglect. A 1st century stele at Maragh tells of a merchant who skipped the ritual for 3 consecutive years. When archaeologists excavated his home centuries later, they found his mummy clutching a scroll that blamed drought and stillbirths on his ancestors' dimmed skulls. His own skeleton showed signs of a self-inflicted punishment, the nasal bone carefully filed down to mirror the polished smoothness he'd failed to provide for his forebears. What seems like morbid obsession was, for the Nubians, the ultimate act of intergenerational care. These weren't corpses being maintained, they were batteries of ancestral magic, their power requiring regular renewal like some ancient supernatural maintenance plan. Today, museum curators note how Nubian skulls often flake less paint than other cultures' relics, testament to nights spent under loving hands, ensuring the dead never faded from the world's memory or its power. In the shadowed alcoves of Nubia's grandest temples, desire wasn't just personal, it was civic duty. Sacred prostitution wasn't merely tolerated, it was institutionalized, with every exchanged coin fueling the kingdom's most ambitious building projects. The Temple of Ammon at Napata kept meticulous records, their sandstone walls etched with columns of names and numbers, not just priests and warriors, but the courtesans whose earnings literally laid the foundations of empire. These weren't clandestine transactions, they were state-sanctioned acts of devotion where intimacy became infrastructure. The system operated with bureaucratic precision. Temple attendants weighed each payment on scaled balances before depositing the coins into alabaster chests marked with the faces of fertility goddesses. A stele discovered at Maragh breaks down the math. Over 5 years, the love offerings of just 37 priestess prostitutes funded an entire irrigation canal, its stone reliefs depicting not just engineers but the women whose beds financed the dig. The most skilled earners received titles like Hand of Hathor and were exempt from other taxes provided they contributed at least half their earnings to public works. But the true innovation lay in accountability. Each courtesan's contributions were carved into temple walls for public display, creating a bizarre hybrid of brothel and bond market. A limestone fragment from Kerma lists one woman's lifetime donations enough to gild a shrine's doors and purchase 6 war elephants for the royal guard. These records weren't dry ledgers, they were bragging rights. The higher a woman's tally, the more elaborate her burial. Top earners were interred with ceremonial dildos of gold and granted posthumous titles like "She Who Built with Pleasure." The rituals surrounding this sacred commerce were as elaborate as they were pragmatic. Before receiving clients, priestesses bathed in milk infused with crushed rose quartz, not for allure, but because the mineral was believed to purify lucre. Their beds were draped with linen woven from flax grown in temple fields, each thread dyed with indigo to represent the Nile's fertile silt. Wall paintings at Wad Ban Nokka show the moment of transaction frozen in time, men dropping coins into a ceremonial slot between two carved lion paws, while the priestess anointed their foreheads with honey, symbolizing the sweetness of mutual benefit. What shocks modern scholars isn't the practice's existence, but its scale. Payroll Ostraka reveals some temple courtesans earned 10 times a skilled laborer's annual wage in a single festival month. Their wealth funded not just temples but libraries, fortifications, and even the famous Mara Dam, a hydrological marvel that turned desert into farmland. The dam's foundation stone bears an inscription rarely taught in history classes, erected through the grace of lovers and the sweat of the bedchamber. The darkest twist emerged in royal audits. Scrolls from Sedenga detail how kings would occasionally borrow from the pleasure coffers during wartime, promising repayment with interest. One such document, sealed with a queen's personal scarab, acknowledges a debt of 600 gold deben, the equivalent of 30 military campaigns, to be repaid from future temple earnings. It's signed not just by the monarch, but by 12 high-ranking courtesans in delicate hieratic script, their names followed by the hieroglyph for womb, marking them as collective creditors to the crown. Perhaps the most poignant evidence comes from a fallen priestess's tomb near the Fourth Cataract. Her sarcophagus wasn't adorned with typical funerary spells, but with an itemized list, every obelisk, every granary her work had funded. The final line reads, "Let my body return to dust, but let these stones speak my name forever." In Nubia's eyes, sacred prostitution wasn't debasement, it was the ultimate alchemy, transforming fleeting passion into monuments that would outlast dynasties. Beneath the shifting sands of Nubia's eastern deserts lie sepulchres more closely guarded than any pharaoh's tomb, the final resting places of royal war elephants, those living siege engines whose thunderous charges decided the fate of empires. These weren't mere animal graves, they were sacred armories of the gods, where the tusks that once shattered enemy lines were systematically destroyed in rituals of startling violence. At sites like Jebel Kali, archaeologists have uncovered vast sunken chambers containing skeletons arranged in perfect military formation, their skulls facing Marame as if awaiting one last command, their once mighty tusks snapped clean at the roots with brutal precision. The process was as ceremonial as it was destructive. When a war elephant died, whether in battle or of old age, an elite unit called the Tusk Breakers would transport the body under cover of darkness to hidden necropolises known only to the royal family. Wall reliefs at Nokka depict the ritual in chilling detail. Priests wearing elephant hide cloaks chanting to the god Apodamak as bronze wedges were hammered into the base of each tusk, not to extract them but to create deliberate fracture lines. Then, using ropes woven from Nile hippopotamus sinew, teams of men would pull in opposite directions until the ivory shattered with a crack that reportedly echoed for miles across the desert. But why destroy such priceless material? Nubian texts speak of the curse of the unbroken tusk, the belief that ivory taken from a war elephant's corpse carried the animal's battle rage into the afterlife, dooming both thief and kingdom. A 1st century stele from Musawar recounts how an entire trading caravan perished after acquiring ill-gotten ivory, their bodies found with bones seemingly crushed by invisible weights. Modern excavations confirm the superstition's power. At a newly discovered graveyard near the Atbara River, every single tusk fragment bore ritual carvings of bound prisoners, transforming each piece into a spiritual prison for the anger it might otherwise unleash. The burial rites themselves were staggeringly elaborate. Elephants that died victorious in battle were interred with full military honors, their feet sheathed in golden sandals, their backs draped with miniature versions of the armor they'd worn in life. One particularly poignant discovery at El Hobogi revealed an old bull buried with its original battle scarves still knotted around its ribs, the fabric woven with the name of a handler dead for 30 years. But the true marvel was the necropolis architecture. Each elephant was laid to rest in a chamber exactly 11 times its body length, the Nubian sacred number of strength, with ceilings painted to resemble the night sky as it appeared on the animal's first combat deployment. What makes these graveyards truly unique is their ongoing spiritual function. Unlike human tombs, which were sealed after burial, elephant necropolises remained active sites of pilgrimage for generations. Veterans would make annual treks to pour beer into the skeletal mouths of their former mounts, believing the liquid revived the animal's spirits for one night of spectral revelry. At Danjel, archaeologists found a later addition to an ancient burial, a Roman-era wine jug placed carefully between the ribs of a skeleton centuries older, proof that even foreign occupiers couldn't resist these rituals. The most chilling evidence of the Tusk's power comes from a rebel king's fate. When the usurper Amenikebult attempted to plunder a graveyard for ivory to fund his revolt, chronicles describe how the stolen fragments turned to fire in his men's hands. His mummy, discovered in a ruined fort, showed third-degree burns on the palms and lips, likely from poisoning, but forever memorialized in temple art as divine retribution. Today, the few intact tusk tips in museums glow with an eerie patina, their surfaces microscopically pitted from acidic rituals meant to deactivate their martial spirit before display. These graveyards weren't just tombs, they were Nubia's ultimate psychological warfare. Neighboring kingdoms whispered of valleys where the earth itself remembered the weight of war elephants, where broken ivory rose through the sand like bleached warnings. In a civilization that built its empire on the backs of these magnificent creatures, ensuring their power wasn't misused in death was as vital as harnessing it in life, even if it meant turning treasure into fragments and glory into guarded dust. The funeral processions of ancient Nubia took a terrifying turn when the sun dipped below the horizon, as mourners donned masks so grotesque they seemed ripped from nightmares. These weren't artistic expressions, they were spiritual traps, carefully crafted decoys designed to lure hungry demons away from vulnerable souls making their journey to the afterlife. Carved from blackened acacia wood or molded from linen stiffened with animal glue, each mask bore exaggerated features, bulging eyes coated in reflective mica to mimic the sheen of living flesh, gaping mouths lined with real human teeth arranged in unnatural snarls, and distended foreheads branded with inverted hieroglyphs that spelled "feast here" in the language of the underworld. The ritual unfolded with macabre precision, as priests chanted spells to open the path to Juat, the realm of the dead. Family members would cluster around the mummy, their monstrous visages bobbing in the torchlight. The theory was simple: malevolent spirits drawn to the scent of decay would mistake these hideous disguises for the true vessels of the deceased. Wall paintings at the Temple of Ammon in Napata depict the moment of deception: shadowy demonic figures with elongated claws latching onto the masks, their essence trapped when priests quickly sealed the eyeholes with molten beeswax. Some masks were even equipped with hidden compartments behind their tongues, filled with rotting meat or menstrual blood, bait for particularly persistent entities. Archaeological evidence reveals how seriously the Nubians took this spiritual defense system. Excavations at Kerma uncovered a mass grave of funerary masks, many still clutching strands of human hair embedded in their surfaces, likely yanked from wearers during violent encounters with unseen forces. The most chilling discovery came from a noblewoman's tomb at Sedenga. Her burial mask had been ritually killed after the funeral, its mouth stitched shut with gold wire and a ceremonial dagger driven through its left eye socket. Accompanying hieroglyphs explained this was done after the mask reportedly screamed through the night for weeks following her burial. The craftsmanship of these masks followed strict sacred geometry. Their proportions were deliberately distorted: noses 3 times longer than human scale, ears positioned at unnatural angles, to exploit demons' supposed poor eyesight. Some featured movable parts. A hinged jaw found at Meroe still bears tooth marks from where priests would clamp it onto living goats during practice rituals, testing its grasping strength. The interiors were no less ingeniously designed, lined with shards of broken mirrors to create spiritual labyrinths that would confuse any entity that breached the outer layer. But the most terrifying aspect was their reuse. Unlike Egyptian death masks that stayed with the mummy, Nubian demon traps were often passed down through generations, accumulating layers of protective spells and potentially trapped spirits. A 1st century Greek trader's journal recounts being shown a family heirloom mask in a Meroe market, its surface pulsating unnaturally in the sunlight, its original wearer having died 2 centuries prior. Modern spectral imaging of similar masks has revealed faint, face-like distortions in the wood grain patterns, perhaps mere tricks of resin crystallization or something far more unsettling. These masks didn't just protect the dead, they safeguarded the living. Many were designed with secondary functions, like the weeping masks that funneled mourners' tears into special channels to create blessed water, or the laughing masks whose hollow cheeks amplified priests' chants to scare away lesser ghosts. Some noble households kept ancestor masks on display for years, periodically offering them beer and honey to maintain the deception that they were still inhabited. The practice's legacy lingers in modern Sudanese folk traditions, where some villages still craft crude facsimiles during burials, not out of belief but as cultural memory. Yet in museum archives, certain Nubian masks remain stored in triple-locked cases, their accession notes ominously warning of temperature drops and whispered voices when undisturbed. Whether these phenomena stem from ancient trickery or something more supernatural, one truth remains: in Nubia's fight against the unseen, even horror could be harnessed as a weapon. The Nile's winding paths weren't just for the living, they were highways for the dead, where mummified ancestors embarked on journeys more lavish than most peasants would ever know. In a practice that blurred the boundaries between reverence and revelry, Nubian families periodically exhumed their preserved forebears for grand processions called the corpse roads, where the dead traveled to visit their living descendants, attended by feasts that could bankrupt a village. These weren't somber affairs, they were vibrant, week-long celebrations where death took a backseat to music, storytelling, and enough food to sate both the living and the departed. The logistics alone were staggering. Before dawn on the appointed day, priests would unseal the ancestral tomb, carefully anointing the mummy's wrappings with resin to reinforce them for travel. Then, lashed to an ornate litter carried by teams of oxen, or for wealthier families atop a gilded palanquin borne by slaves, the deceased would begin their pilgrimage. Wall paintings at Karanog depict these surreal caravans, mummies propped upright as if gazing at the scenery, their skeletal hands clutching staffs adorned with bells to announce their approach. At each village along the route, local relatives would rush forward to greet them, offering libations of beer poured directly into the mummy's mouth through a golden funnel, a gesture believed to briefly revive their thirst for life. But the true spectacle unfolded at nightly rest stops. Families constructed temporary guest houses for their dead, complete with beds of woven reeds and perfumed cushions. Here, the mummies were treated as honored visitors seated at the head of banquet tables, their linen-wrapped limbs arranged in poses of relaxation. Servants would present platters of roasted gazelle and honeyed figs, pretending to feed them while priests chanted spells to activate their senses. A 1st century Greek merchant's account describes stumbling upon one such feast near Dongola, where a child's mummy dined beside its now adult siblings, its shriveled lips smeared with ceremonial wine by a weeping mother who'd lost it decades prior. The feasts themselves were exercises in culinary diplomacy. Hosts competed to impress not just living guests, but the dead, brewing beers from ancestral recipes or serving dishes the deceased had favored in life. At a noble's burial site near Meroe, archaeologists found clay tablets meticulously recording his favorite meals: duck stewed in tamarind, bread flavored with aromatic desert herbs. These weren't mere memorials, they were menus for future corpse road banquets, ensuring every pilgrimage could recreate his preferred afterlife hospitality. Strangest of all were the conversations. Families would update mummies on marriages, births, and crop yields as if they were merely long-absent relatives catching up. Some households took this further, hiring professional corpse speakers, ventriloquists who'd crouch behind the mummy, projecting responses through hollow reeds inserted into its nasal cavity. A particularly eerie relief at Naka shows one such performer mid-performance, his lips pressed to a tube while the mummy's jaw appears to move, its hollow eye sockets reflecting firelight in a way that must have seemed eerily lifelike to intoxicated mourners. The rituals culminated in gift-giving. Living relatives presented the dead with souvenirs for their return to the underworld: miniature tools, carved figurines of new family members, even tiny scrolls detailing recent events. These weren't burned or buried, but physically attached to the mummy's wrappings with threads of gold. One noblewoman's mummy at Sedenga was found with over 300 such offerings layered like a grotesque shawl, including a clay model of a house built years after her death, complete with a speck of paint from its real-world counterpart smeared on the doorway to guide her spirit home. Not every corpse road ended peacefully. Sandstorms could bury processions. Whole excavations near the Third Cataract revealed an entire convoy fossilized mid-journey, their mummies still upright in collapsed litters, surrounded by desiccated banquet remnants. Other mummies simply fell apart en route. Temple records speak of hasty rewrappings, using whatever cloth was available, including one pharaoh whose face was clumsily reconstructed with date paste and pigeon feathers after a particularly rough Nile crossing. The practice only faded when Christianity reached Nubia, but its legacy lingers in modern Sudanese funeral customs, where photos of the dead are still paraded through ancestral villages during memorials. In a civilization that refused to let geography sever familial bonds, death wasn't an ending. It was just another reason to pack a lunch, hitch the oxen, and take a long, celebratory stroll with someone who, though departed, was never truly gone. Deep in the temple vaults of Nubia's astrologer priests, the universe's secrets weren't written in stars alone. They pulsed through the fragile shells of giant ostrich eggs, each one a miniature cosmos waiting to fracture into prophecy. These weren't ordinary eggs, but sacred vessels specially harvested during lunar eclipses, their surfaces meticulously painted with celestial maps using pigments mixed with powdered meteorite. The ritual began at the summer solstice, when the desert heat made the eggs expand ever so slightly, a tension the priests exploited to coax forth the gods' messages through controlled destruction. The preparation process was a marvel of precision. Each egg was first emptied through a needle-thin hole at its base, the yolks and whites collected in golden bowls to be fermented into anointing oil. Then, using brushes made from a virgin ibis's tail feathers, priests would trace the 12 Nubian zodiac constellations along the shell's curve, not as they appeared in the night sky, but inverted, as if viewing the heavens from within the egg itself. The Leo constellation, for instance, sprawled upside down near the pointed end, while the watery coils of Hydra wrapped around the middle like a celestial serpent strangling its prey. Divination occurred during the tense silence before dawn. The high priest would suspend the egg over a brazier of smoldering acacia wood, the heat causing minute cracks to spiderweb across the painted stars. Every pop and creak of the expanding shell was recorded by scribes, a sound thought to be the voices of distant planets. When the egg finally split, the fractures weren't random chaos but sacred text. A crack bisecting the painted moon signified drought. Jagged lines radiating from the Scorpion constellation warned of betrayal. Archaeologists at Kerma uncovered a trove of these shattered relics, their fragments still bearing faint traces of the priest's interpretive markings. One particularly telling shard showed a branching crack labeled in hieratic script, "When the wound crosses the bull's eye, the king's son shall bleed." Historical records confirm this prophecy preceded a bloody coup attempt by a pharaoh's heir. The egg's accuracy wasn't mere coincidence. The priests had engineered their environment to heighten sensitivity. By storing them in underground chambers with fluctuating humidity, the shells developed microscopic weak points that cracked along predictable paths when heated. But the most disturbing variations involved blood eggs. During times of crisis, priests would mix the yolk with a condemned prisoner's blood before resealing the shell with beeswax. When heated, these eggs reportedly screamed as they cracked, their fissures forming shapes interpreters claimed depicted future battle formations or plague vectors. A 2nd century Roman garrison's logbook recounts finding a cache of these eggs near the frontier unbroken after decades. Their contents had putrefied into a substance that allegedly caused hallucinations when inhaled. The egg's afterlife was as ritualized as their use. No fragment was ever discarded. Even the tiniest piece was inscribed with the date of its cracking and incorporated into temple mosaics called star floors, where worshippers would tread barefoot to absorb residual prophetic energy. At the Mara necropolis, excavators found a pharaoh buried atop a mattress stuffed with eggshell shards, each one etched with a fulfilled prediction from his reign. What seems like primitive fortune-telling was, in reality, an intricate fusion of astronomy, materials science, and psychology. By training generations of priests to recognize thousands of fracture patterns, the Nubians created a living database of cause and effect, their cracked eggs less mystical oracles than early probability models, mapping the anxieties of an entire civilization onto the delicate membrane between order and chaos. Today, the faintest tap on one of these ancient shards still echoes like a heartbeat, the sound of a people who believed the future wasn't written in stone, but in the fragile bones of the sky itself. When the skies turned to dust and the Nile's waters shrank to cracked mudflats, Nubian priests performed a deception so audacious it blurred the line between fraud and faith, the blood rain ceremony. High atop sandstone platforms, their shaved heads gleaming under the relentless sun, these holy men would raise copper bowls filled not with blood, but a cunning mixture of pomegranate juice, powdered red ochre, and the rust scraped from ancient battlefield weapons. As desperate villagers watched from below, the priests chanted to the storm god Set, their arms trembling with theatrical exhaustion before suddenly upending the vessels, sending crimson cascades splattering across the dust like divine hemorrhage. The illusion required meticulous preparation. Days before the ritual, temple acolytes scoured the desert for iron-rich rocks, grinding them into pigment while whispering spells to awaken their metallic souls. The final brew was carefully calibrated, thin enough to mimic rain's liquidity, but viscous enough to stain white linen tunics as proof of authenticity. Wall carvings at Jebel Barkal depict the moment of revelation, priests standing in triangular formations, their upturned faces streaked with the same red liquid, their eyes rolled back as if receiving the storm's painful birth. The most skilled practitioners even timed their performances with Khamsin winds, letting the desert gales carry the blood farther across the parched fields, where trembling farmers would collect the dampened soil in amulets. But the true genius lay in the psychological choreography. During particularly severe droughts, the priests escalated the spectacle, burying ox bones beneath the platforms to bleed when stepped on, or hiding animal bladders filled with dye in their sleeves that could be punctured at dramatic moments. A 1st century merchant's account describes witnessing a high priest collapse mid-ceremony, his body writhing as hidden assistants pumped pig's blood through reed tubes hidden in the sand, creating the illusion the earth itself wept crimson. The crowd's reaction was said to be instantaneous, women tearing their hair, warriors offering their own blood in sacrifice, children licking the stained ground, all convinced the gods had finally answered. The aftermath was as carefully managed as the deception. temple scribes documented every rainfall in meticulous detail. The patterns of splatter interpreted as celestial messages, the density of the color graded like some macabre wine vintage. At Kawa, archaeologists found jars labeled with precise drought years, still holding flakes of the original dye mixed with genuine blood, likely added later when the fake rains failed to bring real relief. The most disturbing discovery, a buried cache of child-sized linen shirts, each collar stiff with red ochre, suggesting some families had dressed their youngest in sacrificial white to catch the gods' tears more visibly. What makes this practice uniquely unsettling isn't the deception itself, but its eventual transformation into self-fulfilling prophecy. Scrolls from Mara's final years reveal priests increasingly substituting real animal and possibly human blood into the mixtures as droughts worsen. A jar from the 3rd century bears the inscription, "Third Moon's Offering," its residue testing positive for hemoglobin from at least 17 different sources. In the end, the blood rain ceremony stopped being theater and became something far darker, a civilization so desperate for salvation, it began sacrificing truth itself to the thirsty earth. The final recorded performance occurred during the reign of Queen Lahadamani, when a sandstorm choked the priests mid-ritual, coating their crimson stages in endless tan. That year, the Nile didn't rise at all. In the moonlit silence of Nubia's borderlands, where the desert melted into the afterlife, merchants practiced a trade that defied every law of commerce, bartering with customers who cast no shadow. These weren't ordinary marketplaces, but silent bazaars where goods were laid out at dusk on woven reed mats, only to be found rearranged at dawn, their prices paid in ghost currency. No hands were seen exchanging wares, no voices haggled over prices, just the eerie certainty that spirits had taken what they needed, leaving behind tokens from the underworld in return. The rituals governing these transactions were precise. Before sunset, traders would sweep clean a circular patch of earth, marking its perimeter with lines of powdered lapis lazuli, a mineral believed to glow faintly in the spirit world. Goods were arranged according to strict hierarchies, ivory carvings placed northeast to attract ancestral buyers, woven baskets of grain stacked southwest for hungry desert ghosts. Most chilling of all were the breath prices, where merchants whispered their desired payment into clay pots before sealing them, trusting the dead would hear and comply. Archaeologists at Sai Island uncovered dozens of these pots buried near trading sites, their interiors still holding traces of bizarre offerings, burned hawk feathers, teeth strung on flax threads, even flecks of gold leaf thinner than a cobweb. What appeared on the mats by morning straddled the line between treasure and terror. A merchant might find a handful of Roman coins dated centuries in the future, their edges unnaturally smooth as if worn down by non-existent fingers. Another could discover tiny sculptures of animals never seen in life, 6-legged jackals or fish with human eyes fashioned from some unidentifiable black stone that chilled the skin on contact. The most unsettling accounts come from a Meroitic scroll describing a trader who left out linen and returned to find it stained with perfect hieroglyphs, spelling out a dead queen's complaint about the fabric's quality. But failure to follow protocol invited consequences beyond mere financial loss. Stories tell of merchants who rushed the spirits, checking their goods before dawn, only to find every item replaced with identical copies made of compressed ash. Others reported waking to the scent of myrrh and decay, their payment consisting of fingernail clippings arranged in intricate warning symbols. At Kerma, excavators found a trader's skeleton buried beneath his own stall, his jaw pried open to hold a silver coin bearing the face of a pharaoh who wouldn't rule for another 100 years. The practice wasn't just about commerce, it was a delicate diplomacy with the unseen. Temple records reveal these ghost markets peaked during plagues or famines when the living desperately needed favors from the dead. A priest's ledger from Sedenga details how entire harvests were sold to spirits during droughts, with real grain vanishing overnight and the fields miraculously greening within days. Whether this was divine intervention or clever irrigation hidden by superstition remains unknown. What lingers most hauntingly are the accounts of children playing near these sites at twilight, their laughter reportedly attracting spectral vendors of their own. Folk tales speak of little ones finding perfect toy boats made of reeds that sank in water but floated inexplicably on sand, or dolls with faces that changed expressions when no one was looking. In a civilization where the boundary between worlds was always porous, even commerce couldn't be confined to the living proof that in ancient Nubia, trade routes didn't end at the grave, but wound deeper into the darkness, where the best customers were those who hadn't drawn breath in centuries. From sacred scarifications that turned skin into spiritual armor to the bone-chilling poison oracles where survival decided guilt, ancient Nubia's customs were more than strange traditions. They were the lifeblood of a civilization that thrived in extremes. Imagine a world where kings deliberately ballooned their bodies into grotesque symbols of prosperity, where children's bones became musical instruments for communing with ancestors, and where the dead attended feasts as honored guests. These weren't random acts of barbarism, but calculated acts of survival, a society sculpted by the brutal beauty of the Nile's whims, where every ritual served as both rebellion against chaos and negotiation with the divine. The brilliance of Nubian culture lay in its paradoxes. While Egypt built monuments to eternity, Nubia embraced the raw, messy vitality of existence. Their war dances ended in collapse, their justice relied on poisoned chalices, and their commerce extended beyond the grave, not because they feared death, but because they refused to let it sever earthly bonds. Even their gold mines weren't just sources of wealth, but sacred prisons for divine rage, their treasures guarded by taboos stronger than any lock. This was a civilization that understood power wasn't just about control, but about controlled unraveling, whether through drunken festivals that inverted the social order or phantom weddings that defied mortality itself. What makes these practices unforgettable isn't just their shock value, but what they reveal about human resilience. In a land where the desert could swallow cities whole and the Nile's absence meant starvation, Nubians transformed fear into ritual, suffering into sacrament. Every severed ear dangling from city gates was a plea for order, every tear collected in golden vials a testament to love's endurance beyond death. Their extremes weren't mindless cruelty, they were desperate poetry written in blood, sweat, and ibis feathers. So which ritual left you breathless? The lion pits where false kings met their end, the child sacrifices beneath the eclipsed sun, or perhaps the eerie corpse roads where mummies attended their own banquets? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We're endlessly fascinated by how differently ancient cultures wrestled with life's big questions. And if you're hungry for more deep dives into history's wildest corners, hit that subscribe button. From the blood-soaked temples of Mesoamerica to the ghost ships of the Baltic, we're just getting started on uncovering humanity's most astonishing chapters. The past is stranger than fiction, and we're here to expose every glorious, unsettling inch